It's 1758, and 2,000 Comanche warriors storm a Spanish mission on the San Saba River. They torch it, kill 8 people, including 2 priests, leaving Spain shaking. Historians say this one tribe stopped the Spanish cold and held up Texas for 40 years. 40 years. Some argue it's just geography, but come on. 20,000 to 40,000 fierce horsemen ruling the plains? That's no accident. How did they pull this off? And what broke their reign? Let's talk about the Comanche. These guys were tough as nails, a tribe that stopped the Spanish from moving north and the French from spreading west out of Louisiana. That's no small deal. It held up Texas and other plain states for 40 years before the U.S. could even start building there. We're talking from the early 1800s to the 1840s, a full generation of delay because of them. They started out as hunters, but by the end, they were running the show on the plains, all thanks to horses. So where did they come from? They were originally part of the Shoshone tribe, living in the Great Basin out west, places like Nevada, Utah, and Idaho today. Back then, they spoke the same language, something in the Numic family, and lived off hunting and gathering. No farms, no cities, just tracking deer and picking berries in the mountains. That's them before the big change, probably around the 1680s or 1690s, when they got horses. And man, did that flip everything. Those horses came from Spanish herds spilling north, Mustangs running wild. And once the Comanche had them, they weren't just hunters anymore. They turned into a mobile, hard-hitting crew. With horses, they ditched the mountains and their Shoshone buddies. By the early 1700s, they're moving to eastern Colorado and western Kansas, then heading south to the Great Plains. Why? The South Plains had it all: warmer weather, tons of buffalo, and wild horses everywhere. The file says they found a lot of buffalo and Mustang horses. A perfect environment. Perfect's right. Buffalo gave them meat, hides for clothes and tents, and horses became their whole way of life. They could chase herds, fight on the move, and trade like pros. Horses weren't just transport, they were power. They didn't just wander in, though. Tribes up north and east, like the Blackfoot and Crow, were getting guns from European traders, putting heat on the Comanche. So they pushed south, taking over a huge chunk of land, north, central, and west Texas, plus parts of Colorado and Kansas. That's Comanchería, their territory, and it wasn't small, hundreds of thousands of square miles by the 1700s. The file calls it a vast area of the South Plains, and that's when they got their name. The Ute tribe dubbed them Comanche, from a word meaning enemy, or anyone who wants to fight me all the time. Spot on, because they were always ready to throw down. But they called themselves Nemena, just the people. Here's how they rolled. They split into bands, little groups of families. When a guy got married, he'd leave his folks and join his wife's family. Kept things tight. Each band had chiefs, one for peace and one for war, picked by everyone agreeing. The peace chief usually had the most pull, says the file, because they valued talk as much as action. Kids learned to ride horses young, like 4 or 5, and both men and women got scary good at it. The file says in Horsemanship, the Comanche had no equals, and that's no exaggeration. They were the best riders out there. This all sets the stage. From a quiet life in the Great Basin to a force that stalled empires, the Comanche used horses to rewrite their story. By the early 1700s, they're trading with the French for guns and ammo, swapping goods with the Wichita on the Red River, and shoving out tribes like the Apache. They went from scraping by to ruling a plains empire, and it started with that one big move south. How they turned that into a 40-year headache for Spain, France, and later Texas. That's where this gets wild. Now let's get to the part where the Comanche go from regular folks to a total powerhouse. Sometime in the late 1600s, probably around the 1680s or 1690s, they got their hands on horses. This wasn't just a little upgrade. It turned them into a mounted, well-equipped, and powerful force practically overnight. The file says it drastically altered their culture, and that's putting it mildly. Before this, they were hunters and gatherers stuck in the mountains of the Great Basin, chasing deer and picking plants. Horses flipped that whole deal. They went from walking everywhere to riding fast, hitting hard, and covering ground like nobody else. Those horses came from Spanish herds that had spread north, Mustangs running wild across the plains. And the Comanche grabbed that opportunity with both hands. Once they had horses, everything changed about how they lived and moved. The file says their new mobility let them leave their mountain home and their Shoshone neighbors behind. And that's exactly what happened. By the early 1700s, they're heading out to eastern Colorado and western Kansas, then pushing south to the Great Plains. Why there? The South Plains were a gold mine, a warmer climate than the chilly Great Basin, herds of buffalo as far as you could see, and wild Mustang horses everywhere. The file calls it a perfect environment, and they're not wrong. Buffalo meant food on the table, meat to eat, hides for clothes and tents, while horses gave them the freedom to chase those herds wherever they went. They didn't just settle in, they turned that land into a buffalo-rich paradise they could rule. This move wasn't random. They had pressure coming from the north and east, where tribes like the Blackfoot and Crow were picking up guns from European traders. Staying put wasn't an option, so they rolled south with their new horsepower. By the time they hit the South Plains, North, Central, and West Texas included, they're not just surviving anymore. They're setting up shop. The file says this is when they rapidly evolved into something big, and you can see why. Horses didn't just get them around, they made them a force. They could hunt buffalo on the fly, swinging lassos or shooting arrows from the saddle, and they could fight off anyone who tried to mess with them. That's the kind of edge that turns a small tribe into a name people fear. And here's where they really shine: horsemanship. The Comanche took riding to a whole other level. Kids were on horses, by age 4 or 5, learning the ropes, before they could even read or write if they'd had books, which they didn't. Men and women both got so good at it that the file flat out says in horsemanship, the Comanche had no equals. They weren't just decent riders, they were the best in the West, hands down. Imagine a guy leaning off the side of a galloping horse, firing arrows under its neck, or a woman steering with her knees while she's got a kid strapped to her back. That's the kind of skill we're talking about. They practiced this stuff from childhood, and it paid off big time. Horses became more than just a tool for them. They were the backbone of everything. The file says it defined the Comanche way of life, and you can't argue with that. They followed buffalo herds across hundreds of miles, hitting them with speed and precision. They fought battles on horseback, outrunning and outmaneuvering enemies who couldn't keep up. And they traded horses. 2 Mustangs were gold, a measure of wealth, something they could swap with the French for guns, or with the Wichita for other goods down on the Red River. The file mentions that trade, and it's a big deal. Guns and ammo from the French turned their horse-powered raids into something unstoppable. This horse revolution didn't just move them south, it built Comancheria, that massive stretch of plains they'd soon dominate. From the late 1600s to the early 1700s, they went from mountain nobodies to a tribe that could take on anyone. They pushed out the Apache in Texas by the early 1700s, setting the stage for bigger fights with Spain and France. Horses made them fast, fierce, and filthy rich in buffalo and trade. That's how you go from zero to a powerhouse in a couple decades flat. By the early 18th century, the Comanche had staked their claim on a huge piece of land, and they weren't messing around. They ruled a massive chunk of the South Plains, covering North, Central, and West Texas, plus parts of eastern Colorado and western Kansas. This wasn't just a spot they crashed in. It was their empire, called Comanchería. The Chicarito file says it was a vast area of the South Plains, And we're talking hundreds of thousands of square miles by the 1720s or 1730s. They didn't just wander into this territory, they took it, pushing out tribes like the Apache, who were already there. By the early 1700s, they'd forced the Apache south, clearing the way to make this land their own. It stretched so far that it bumped up against Spanish and French edges. And that's when people started sweating their presence. They didn't sit still in Comanchería either. They worked it like pros. They traded with the French in the early 1700s, grabbing guns and ammo to beef up their firepower. The file mentions this trade, and it was a game changer. Those weapons paired with their horses made them a nightmare to face. They also swapped goods with the Wichita tribe down on the Red River, probably stuff like hides or horses for whatever the Wichita brought in. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. They had pressure coming from the north and east, where tribes like the Blackfoot and Crow were getting well armed through European traders. Those guys had guns too, and they weren't friendly neighbors, so the Comanche had to stay sharp and keep moving south to hold their ground. What kept Comanchería ticking was how they lived off the land and ran their people. Buffalo were their bread and butter, giving them food, clothes, and shelter. The file says they were crucial to the Comanche, and that's no lie. One buffalo could feed a family, clothe them in hides, and cover a tent to sleep under. Then there were the horses, their real lifeblood. They used them for hunting buffalo, riding down herds with bows or spears, and for war, charging enemies at full speed. Horses weren't just for getting around. They were trade gold and a way to measure wealth. The file calls them a valuable trade commodity and a measure of Comanche wealth. So if you had a big herd, you were a big deal. They'd trade Mustangs with the French or Wichita, keeping their economy rolling. On top of that, they had a system to keep everything together. The Comanche split into bands, little groups of families that ran themselves. The file says these were autonomous bands made of families, and that setup let them spread out across Comanchería without stepping on each other's toes. When a guy got married, he'd leave his own family and join his wife's, tying those bands tight. Each band picked two chiefs, one for peace, one for war, and everyone had to agree on who got the job. The file points out that democratic principle was strongly implanted in how they did things, and usually the peace chief had the most sway. War chiefs led the fights, sure, but the peace chief kept the band steady day to day, balancing talk with action. This whole deal, land, trade, buffalo, horses, and their way of running things, made Comanchería a force. By the 1720s, they're not just holding ground, they're flexing on anyone nearby. They'd already shoved the Apache out of Texas by the early 1700s, and the file says that's when they really became known as Comanches, a name from the Ute word meaning enemy or anyone who wants to fight me all the time. They called themselves Nemena, the people, but that Ute label stuck because it fit. They were traders, fighters, and buffalo hunters, all rolled into one, and they built an empire on the plains that Spain and France couldn't crack. How they kept that up against bigger players is where this story gets good. By the mid-1700s, the Comanche were ready to throw down with anyone who stepped into their world, and Spain found that out the hard way. In 1758, about 2,000 Comanche warriors teamed up with allied tribes, hit a Spanish mission on the San Saba River. This place was built for the Apache, but the Comanche weren't having it. They sacked the mission, burned it to the ground, and killed 8 people, including 2 priests. The file says it clear, they left nothing standing. They didn't go quietly, though. Big mistake. The Comanche and their allies met them on the Red River, near what's now Spanish Fort, and crushed them in a day-long fight. The Spanish had numbers and guns, but the Comanche had horses and home turf, and that was enough to send Spain packing. Spain couldn't beat them, so they tried talking instead. By 1785, they sent officials into Comanchería to cut a deal. The file says they negotiated peace with offers and promises of gifts, And it worked for a while. They handed over goods, probably stuff like tools, cloth, or weapons, and kept the peace going until around 1800. Back then, the Comanche were at their peak, with a population estimated between 20,000 and 40,000, according to the file. That's a lot of people spread across the plains, all riding horses and ready to fight. But things fell apart in the early 1800s. Spain's power was crumbling. They couldn't keep up the gifts, and the Comanche weren't about to sit quiet. Raids kicked off again, and this time they hit harder, taking what they wanted and reminding everyone who ran the South Plains. Then Mexico stepped into the picture. After winning independence from Spain in 1821, they took over the land, but it didn't change much for the Comanche. The file says the change of government had little impact in Comanchería, and that's because the Comanche kept doing their thing. They started raiding deep into Mexican territory, grabbing horses, cattle, and anything else they could carry. They'd turn around and sell that loot to U.S. traders rolling into Texas, who were happy to trade back arms and ammo. The file mentions how those Americans furnished the Comanches with trade goods, including arms and ammunition, and that kept their war machine humming. Mexico didn't take it lying down, though. They pushed tribes like the Shawnee and Cherokee to fight the Comanche. But it wasn't enough to stop the raids. Things got messier when American settlers showed up. Mexico passed a colonization law in 1824, letting foreigners pour into Texas. These U.S. settlers came in droves, and at first, they got along okay with the Comanche, trading horses and goods. The file says a friendly relationship grew from that trade, but it didn't last. By the 1830s, those settlers were plopping down farms and towns right on the Comanche's traditional hunting grounds, the same spots they'd relied on for buffalo. That flipped the switch. The file says the two soon became enemies, and you can see why the Comanche weren't about to let outsiders carve up their land without a fight. Raids on settlements started popping off, and the tension kept building. This was the Comanche at their peak, taking on empires and settlers like it was nothing. From torching that San Saba mission in 1758 to rolling over Spanish troops in 1759, they showed Spain who was boss. The 1785 peace deal held them back for a bit, but when it fell apart by the 1800s, they hit Mexico and U.S. settlers just as hard. With 20,000 to 40,000 people at their height, they had the numbers, the horses, and the guts to keep Comanchería untouchable. How they handled the next wave, Texas going solo, and the U.S. stepping in, that's where the real fireworks start. By the 1830s, the Comanche were locked in a brutal tug-of-war with Texas, and it only got uglier from there. Things kicked off hard in spring 1840 with the Council House fight in San Antonio. Texas officials invited a Comanche peace delegation to talk, but it went south fast. The Texans tried to arrest them, and a brawl broke out. The file says 35 Comanches got killed, including 12 chiefs, while 30 others, mostly women and kids, ended up jailed. The Texans didn't walk away clean either. 7 died and 8 took wounds. It was a mess, and the Comanche weren't about to let it slide. That summer, a war chief named Buffalo Hump rounded up about 500 warriors and swept south for payback. They hit Victoria and Linville, killed 25 Texans, and burned whatever they could touch. The file calls it a devastating raid, and it was, until they got caught heading back north. Texas Rangers jumped them at Plum Creek, and it turned into a fight. The Comanche lost. The Rangers counted 12 bodies, though the real number might have been higher, and the Texans took 11 casualties. It was bloody, but it showed the Comanche weren't backing down easy. This whole mess had roots a few years earlier, tied to a kid who'd become a big name. Back in 1836, when Texas broke free from Mexico, the Comanche were still running the plains. During one raid, they grabbed a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. The file says she integrated into the tribe. And that's no small thing. She didn't just survive. She became one of them. She married a Comanche man and had a son around 1845 named Quanah Parker, who'd grow up to be their last great chief. Her story's wild. Taken at 9, she turned Comanche through and through, and her kid ended up leading the fight years later. The file doesn't say much about her early life, but that 1836 raid stuck because Quanah's name carries the weight of their final stand. Fast forward to 1874, and the Comanche are in a corner, fighting to hang on. The Red River War was their last big push, and Quanah was right in the middle of it. In June, he teamed up with a medicine man named White Eagle, who promised they'd beat the whites. They led an attack on buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls in Hutchinson County, a spot where about 28 hunters were holed up in an old fort. The file says the Comanche, Kiowas, and Cheyennes had them outnumbered bad, hundreds against a handful. But those hunters had long-range buffalo rifles. The natives couldn't break through. The fort held, and the guns picked them off from a distance. It was a bust, and the file says it destroyed the natives' faith. That loss hit hard, and the U.S. didn't waste time hitting back. By September 1874, the Army came for blood in what's now called the Red River War. Colonel Ronald S. Mackenzie led a surprise attack on a Comanche camp in Palo Duro Canyon. They didn't kill many. Casualties were light, but they torched everything that mattered. The file says they destroyed their horse herd and supplies. And that was the real killer. Hundreds of horses gone, food and gear burned. Winter was coming, and the Comanche couldn't survive it. Quanah's group held out on the Stake Plains for almost a year, dodging and scraping by. But by 1875, they were done. The file marks them as the last free Comanches to surrender, dragged to the Fort Sill Reservation with the Kiowas and Apaches. Their numbers were wrecked too, from tens of thousands at their peak. They're down to 1,600 by 1875, per the file. This was survival mode, plain and simple. The 1840 Council House fight sparked a revenge raid that shook Texas, but Plum Creek showed they couldn't win every time. Cynthia Ann's kidnapping in 1836 gave them Quanah, who led that desperate 1874 stand at Adobe Walls and Palo Duro. The file says they saw their way of life rapidly vanishing, and that's the truth. Buffalo were disappearing, settlers were closing in, and the army had the upper hand. From 500 warriors tearing through towns to a beat-down camp with no horses, the Texas Wars broke their run. How they hung on after that. After the Texas Wars, the Comanche were on the ropes, and the U.S. government wasn't letting up. In 1867, they signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty, or more like got forced into it. This was the last treaty they'd make, and it shoved them, along with the Kiowas and Kiowa Apaches, onto a reservation between the Washita and Red Rivers, in what's now southwestern Oklahoma. This wasn't a choice. It was a done deal to clear the plains for settlers. Their population crashed, down from tens of thousands at their peak in the 1700s to just 1,600 by 1875. They ended up at Fort Sill, sharing space with the Kiowas and Apaches, and life there flipped everything. The government wanted them to ditch hunting and start farming, pushing plows instead of chasing buffalo. Turning hunters and warriors into farmers and stockmen wasn't an easy switch when your whole world's been about horses and open land. They didn't go quietly, though. Even before Fort Sill, some bands held out. Back in 1854, Texas set up 2 reservations after joining the U.S. in 1845, and about 350 Comanches moved in, weakened by war, disease, and disappearing buffalo herds. But most kept roaming free until the Civil War hit in the 1860s. With the frontier wide open during that mess, raids spiked again, and they made the most of it. Once the war ended in 1865, the feds doubled down, setting up defenses and hammering out treaties like Medicine Lodge to box them in. By 1875, after the Red River War crushed their horse herds and supplies, every last band was dragged to Fort Sill. Their cultural values and beliefs took a beating there as the U.S. pushed them to live like white folks, farming, schooling, the works. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the Comanche showed they could adapt and still kick butt. During World War II from 1941 to 1945, 17 Comanche code talkers stepped up. They used their language, an unbreakable code that stumped the Germans, to send messages the enemy couldn't crack. These guys worked alongside other tribes, like the Navajo, turning their native tongue into a secret weapon. It's a far cry from riding horses into battle, but it's the same grit, taking what they had and making it count. They contributed big to the war effort, proving they weren't just fading away after Fort Sill. Then came 1901, when the reservation days ended. The U.S. cut a deal with the Comanche, Kiowas, and Apaches, splitting up the land. Each man, woman, and kid got 160 acres, with extra set aside for churches, agencies, and schools. In return, they gave up most of their territory, over 500,000 acres, or 862 square miles, and took $2 million for it. Comanche leaders fought the deal, saying it screwed them over, but the feds didn't budge. The leftover land opened to the public, and soon whites outnumbered them on what used to be their turf. After that, a lot of Comanches scattered, chasing jobs in towns or cities. World War II pulled more into the mix. Some joined the military, others worked defense jobs, like those code talkers. Today, they're still around and kicking. The Comanche Nation's got about 16,000 members now, with almost 8,000 living near Lawton, Oklahoma. Back in the 1960s, they tapped into a wave of native pride and started rebuilding. They set up their own tribal government, running things out of Lawton, a move sparked by a resurgence of native nationalism. From 1,600 souls at Fort Sill in 1875 to 16,000 today, they've clawed their way back. They're not the Plains warriors of the 1700s, but they've kept their name alive, surviving treaties, wars, and a world that tried to erase them. That's the Comanche story, from fighting empires to coding in wars to running their own show now. The Comanche story is about raw power, resilience, and refusing to fade away. They went from hunters in the Great Basin to horse-riding rulers of Comanchería by the 1700s, halting Spain and France with raids like San Saba in 1758 and dominating the Texas plains until 1875. They fought empires, settlers, and the U.S., with battles like the 1840 Council House fight and Quanah Parker's 1874 stand proving they'd go down swinging. War, disease, and lost buffalo dropped them to 1,600, but they adapted code talkers in World War II. And a tribal government today, with 16,000 members, show they're still here. This video is about how one tribe bent history, survived the odds, and kept their fire alive. Loved it? Subscribe, share your take below for more stories that pack a punch.